The U.S. president who spent 48 days bombing Iran, who imposed a naval blockade, who threatened to destroy Iranian civilization, has just said thank you to Iran, in all caps, on Truth Social. His exact words: Iran has just announced that the strait is fully open and ready for full passage. Thank you. Thank you. Every news network will cover this today as an American victory. Trump forced Iran's hand. Maximum pressure worked. The blockade won. I want to argue exactly the opposite. What happened today is not an American victory. What happened today is Iran demonstrating, for the whole world to see, that it controls the terms of the situation. Not America, Iran. And the reason Iran was able to do this has a name that Washington hasn't been paying attention to for the past 10 years. China. The figures come from the Western establishment, not from Iranian propaganda. America deployed 16 warships and more than 10,000 troops to control the Strait of Hormuz, 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. 48 days of the most intensive bombing campaign in the Middle East since the Gulf War. Defense Secretary Hegseth said from the Pentagon podium, in exact words, "You control nothing." The Central Bank of Iran admitted it could take 12 years to rebuild. Iran has lost its supreme leader and dozens of senior commanders. The economy is devastated. That is confirmed. What is being disputed is the context. Brent crude surpassed $120 a barrel when Hormuz closed. The head of the IEA stood before the cameras and said that Europe had 6 weeks of jet fuel remaining. China had 4 months' worth of supply stockpiled. The Prime Minister of Spain said openly, "There is no one else who can resolve this situation except China." This is not journalistic commentary. This is a structural verdict. And here is the number that tells the whole story of the war in a single statistic. China's customs records show 0 imports from Iran since 2022. 0. Officially, China hasn't bought Iranian oil for 4 years. However, China's recorded imports of Malaysian oil in 2025 reached 1.3 million barrels per day, more than double Malaysia's total oil production. All of Malaysia does not produce as much oil as China allegedly imported from it. The oil was Iranian. The paperwork said Malaysian. And that is the mechanism. China operates what analysts call a dark fleet, oil tankers that physically disable their automatic identification systems, the GPS transponders that tell satellite tracking services where they are. They sail invisibly. They conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, far from port, transferring Iranian crude to vessels with different flags and different ownership structures, before these ships sail to Chinese refineries. Teapot refineries, small enough to operate outside the mainstream global financial system, absorb every barrel without asking any questions. America built sanctions designed to cut off Iran's oil revenue. China built a logistics infrastructure that rendered those sanctions irrelevant. And no one in Washington, despite all the financial surveillance, despite all the threats of secondary sanctions, has managed to stop this system. This comes as no surprise to anyone familiar with military history. And the most accurate comparison is not Iraq, not Vietnam, not Afghanistan. It is Suez, 1956. In 1956, Britain and France launched a military operation to seize the Suez Canal after Egyptian President Nasser nationalized it. The operation was militarily successful. British and French forces were winning on the ground, and then the United States told Britain to stop. Not through military force, through economic pressure. America threatened to withhold support for the British pound if Britain did not withdraw. Britain's currency reserves were nearly depleted. Facing financial collapse rather than military defeat, Britain withdrew. France withdrew. Nasser kept the canal. And the moment was forever remembered as Britain's Suez. The moment when Britain discovered that military success means nothing if the economic architecture beneath you can be pulled out from under you. What happened today in Hormuz is America's Suez, not because America was defeated militarily, it wasn't, but because America discovered that its maximum pressure kit, sanctions, the blockade, financial warfare, the military campaign, has encountered a counter-architecture that China has spent a decade building. Just as Britain's Suez revealed that British military power could not overcome American financial power, America's Hormuz reveals that American military power cannot overcome Chinese economic architecture. There is a second historical parallel, even more revealing. Before America formally entered World War II in December 1941, it provided Britain with what Roosevelt called Lend-Lease: weapons, food, ships, raw materials. America was not fighting Germany. America was not at war. But America provided the economic framework that allowed Britain to hold out long enough for the strategic situation to change. Without Lend-Lease, Britain would not have survived 1941. Without surviving 1941, there would be no D-Day in 1944. China is doing something structurally similar for Iran, but more sophisticated. Lend-Lease was public policy, debated in Congress, covered by the newspapers. China's support for Iran has been almost entirely invisible. The yuan payments, the shadow fleet, the strategic reserve, the UN veto, none of these have been announced as a Chinese alliance with Iran. They simply operate, quietly, consistently, in ways that are very difficult for America to confront directly without triggering a much larger conflict. And here is the layer that no one is discussing. China has built what I call a survival infrastructure, and it has three pillars that the mainstream media isn't connecting. Pillar 1, the yuan payment system. China has been buying Iranian oil in Chinese yuan, not in dollars, since the early years of U.S. sanctions. This entirely bypasses the SWIFT financial network. SWIFT is the system that connects global banks and enables international payments in dollars. U.S. sanctions work by cutting countries off from SWIFT. If you can't receive dollars, you can't pay for imports, you can't pay your military, you can't function as a modern economy. Iran should have been cut off from global trade years ago. It wasn't cut off because China built a parallel system that doesn't use dollars, a system where the yuan flows from Chinese refineries directly into Iranian accounts through second-tier Chinese banks that have no exposure to the U.S. financial system. Pillar 2, the strategic reserve. China entered this war with approximately 1.2 billion barrels of crude oil in strategic storage, built up over 2 years by purchasing sanctioned Iranian and Russian oil at heavily discounted prices. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and Brent prices skyrocketed, China did not panic. Its markets remained stable. Its refineries continued to operate. Its factories continued to produce. America calculated that closing Hormuz would create economic pain that would force Iran to negotiate. China had already neutralized that calculation by stockpiling supplies before the crisis began. America's economic weapon, the energy shock, landed on everyone except the country where America needed it to land. Pillar 3, the UN veto. China vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that would have authorized international forces to open the strait. China called the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible in its strongest possible diplomatic language. China sent Wang Yi to call Arakchi and tell him that China was ready to support a resolution. And this is where it connects to your pocketbook. That same architecture, yuan off the dollar, strategic reserves, UN veto, is what explains why North Korea has survived 3 decades of American sanctions, why Venezuela has survived, why Russia has absorbed the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history and is still fighting a major war in Ukraine. The common thread in every case where American economic warfare has failed to produce the intended result is China. This means that every time America tightens sanctions against any country in the world, and that cost shows up at the gas pump, on your electric bill, in the price of everything you buy, the primary tool of American foreign policy has a structural vulnerability. That vulnerability is China, and the live demonstration of this, watched by every government in the world today, has just taken place. What comes next? The opening of Hormuz is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new phase, and there are possible scenarios, each more serious than the last. The first, the U.S. blockade remains in place over Iranian ports. The deal is not sealed. Iran still has enriched uranium. The nuclear issue remains unresolved. The ceasefire expires in 4 days. Iran is now negotiating, not from a position of weakness, but from the position of a country that has demonstrated it could hold the world's most critical energy choke point for 48 days and survive the most intensive U.S. military campaign since the Gulf War. This is an extraordinary negotiating position for a country that has been bombed for 7 weeks. The second scenario, China continues doing exactly what it has been doing. It continues calling for a comprehensive ceasefire. It continues warning against escalation. It continues buying Iranian oil. It continues to provide the economic lifeline that gives Iran the ability to negotiate rather than surrender. And when the deal is done, in whatever form it takes, China emerges with something more valuable than any military victory: a permanent structural position as the country the rest of the world turns to when it needs protection from American economic pressure. The third scenario is the most serious. Every government in the world saw today's demonstration. If China was able to build the infrastructure that gave Iran the ability to open the Strait of Hormuz on its own terms, what does that mean for any future American attempt to use economic pressure against any country that has deep ties with China? The answer is that the American sanctions and blockade toolkit has a structural vulnerability. It inflicts damage, but it does not force capitulation. Trump said, "Thank you," in capital letters. Stocks rose, oil fell, and everyone called it a victory. The correct reading is this: Iran was able to make this choice, to choose the timing, the conditions, the framework, because China spent a decade building the economic infrastructure that kept Iran alive under the most intense American pressure it has ever faced. America brought maximum force. China had already built maximum resilience. Every empire eventually faces the moment when it discovers that the rules of the game have changed while it wasn't paying attention. Rome discovered this in the Parthian Wars. Britain discovered it at Suez in 1956. America is discovering this today in the Strait of Hormuz. I leave you with a number: 1.3 million barrels per day of oil that officially did not come from Iran, but obviously did. That is the entire story of this war in a single statistic. It is the system that China built, the system that kept Iran alive, the system that made today possible, and the system that America, despite all its intelligence capabilities, has failed to stop. Watch the next round of negotiations carefully, not for what Iran demands, but for what China doesn't say. Because in this story, as in every major strategic shift in modern history, the most important player is the one who says the least while building the most. And the question that mainstream commentary isn't asking, the one you need to take with you today, is this: if China built the infrastructure that made today possible, what else has China already built for the next crisis that America hasn't yet identified? The answer to that question is the most important strategic question of the next decade. Subscribe to the channel, because we're going to be tracking this every single day.